Good evening. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I welcome you and thank you for coming. Let me begin by acknowledging the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, including lead sponsor, Bank of America, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, Raytheon, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, WBUR, and NECM. The country celebrated the 50th anniversary of the inauguration of President Kennedy last month, marking what Robert Frost, the first poet ever to be invited to participate in an inaugural ceremony, called at the time a golden age of poetry and power, of which this noonday is the beginning hour. Among the many things JFK and Frost shared in common was a great respect for the arts. President Kennedy once quipped, "There's a story that some years ago an interested mother wrote to her principal of a school. Don't teach my boy poetry, he's going to run for Congress." Kennedy continued, "I've never taken the view that the world of politics and the world of poetry are so far apart. In fact, if more politicians knew poetry and more poets knew politics, I'm convinced the world would be a better place in which to live." After the death of Robert Frost in 1963, JFK spoke about the importance of the arts at the dedication of a library named in Frost's honor at Amherst College. Let's watch a brief excerpt with apologies for a brief skip from the original video.
Robert Frost was one of the granite figures of our time in America. He was supremely two things, an artist and an American. A nation reveals itself not only by the men it produces, but also by the men it honors, the men it remembers. In America, our heroes have customarily run to men of large accomplishments. But today, this college and country honors a man whose contribution was not to our size, but to our spirit, not to our political beliefs, but to our insight. Not to our self-esteem, but to our self-comprehension. In honoring Robert Frost, we therefore can pay honor to the deepest sources of our national strength. That strength takes many forms, and the most obvious forms are not always the most significant. The strength matters, but the spirit which informs and controls our strength matters just as much. This was the special significance of Robert Frost. He brought an unsparing instinct for reality to bear on the platitudes and pieties of society. His sense of the human tragedy fortified him against self-deception and easy consolation. "I have been," he wrote, "one acquainted with the night." And because he knew the midnight as well as the high noon, because he understood the ordeal as well as the triumph of the human spirit, he gave his age strength with which to overcome despair.
The speech goes on. Quote, "It is hardly an accident that Robert Frost coupled poetry and power, for he saw poetry as the means of saving power from itself." One of my favorite documents in this library is the typewritten draft of that speech that includes the next line, "When power inebriates, poetry invokes sobriety," which the president edited in his dashing handwriting, "When power corrupts, poetry cleanses." As a wordsmith, John Kennedy was no slouch. The full line reads, "When power corrupts, poetry cleanses, for art establishes the basic human truths which must serve as the touchstones of our judgment." And so we gather here this evening to celebrate the poets and lyricists among us whose artistry reveals the truths and touchstones of our time. How honored we are to have with us this evening Bill Flanagan, Paul Muldoon, and Paul Simon. We are proud to partner in this effort with Penn New England. This library is also home to the Ernest Hemingway collection, and we often collaborate with our Penn colleagues on literary programming, including the Penn Hemingway Award, given annually to an author for best work of first fiction. And before I welcome to the stage Penn New England's chair, Richard Hoffman, to set the scene and introduce our moderator, I hope you will allow me a brief remembrance, evocative perhaps of the personal connections that brought many of you here this evening. I've often remarked that in the Irish Catholic home where I grew up, the images of the Kennedy brothers were as prominent as the religious icons on our family room walls. My parents did their best to pass along to their children the religious foundation and cultural affiliations that informed their lives. Yet what bound us together as a family more than politics or religion was the music that animated our home. For my father, the barbershop tunes of his youth saw his family through the Depression and him and his brother through World War II. With a special appreciation for musical harmony, when my older siblings brought home the records of Simon and Garfunkel, my dad appropriated them as his own, once famously playing the Bridge Over Troubled Waters album continuously for an entire weekend while wallpapering our den. After singing along to the title song, I recall him pronouncing, "Now that should be our national anthem." So when we hear those songs now, it is like meeting some old friends. And whether they remind us of our childhood or the loss of two Kennedy brothers who did so much to shape our world, the lyrics still resonate. Time it was, and what a time it was. It was the time of innocence, the time of confidences. And we follow the song's bidding, preserving the photographs and memories that have been left to us in family scrapbooks, archives, and museums. And pause at moments like this to honor a man who has contributed to our spirit and our self-comprehension and express appreciation for the gift of his music that so deeply touches our lives.
Thank you, Tom. It takes a brave man to get up here and speak after JFK. And thanks to the JFK Library for hosting us this evening. I'm not even going to try to hide how elated I am. I'm almost giddy to be in the company of three of the most accomplished artists of our time. And I'm aware, looking out at the whole beautiful throng of you who came out this evening all decked out and beaming with anticipation, that you are being polite and you wish that for God's sake I'd hurry this up and get on with the program. And I will, I promise, I will. I want to point out that there will be people moving through the aisles with index cards, gathering questions from you that will be passed up to the front as part of the discussion. And in just a moment, I'm going to call on Bill Flanagan to get us started. But first, I want to say we've been talking for a long time at Penn New England about lyrics as literature. That is, as language that helps us articulate our humanity and come to terms with our lives. After all, behind the music, before the music, there is a writer, turning a phrase, tuning a phrase, trying to put the best words in the best order, as Coleridge described the poet's work. We're an organization devoted to writers and writing, so of course we wanted to have this conversation. But we wanted to be sure to do it right. And we needed the right person to do it. Enter Bill Flanagan, a writer whose love of music, keen understanding of the creative process, and warm and generous spirit make him that person. Music critic, scholar, editor, producer, mentor to scores of musicians and songwriters. Bill is the author of 2 works of nonfiction and 3 novels, one of which, A&R, was, at least until recently, widely acclaimed as the best rock and roll novel ever written. Kurt Anderson, author of Turn of the Century, called A&R ferocious satire with a moral compass. Adam F. Duritz of Counting Crows called it a straight-up high-fidelity ride. And Kirkus Reviews said Flanagan's music industry is a legitimate metaphor for the way we live now. I say that A&R was, until recently, the best rock and roll novel ever written because his latest novel, Evening's Empire, is now the best rock and roll novel ever written. To be honest, Bill is a lot more than moderator tonight. He's the guy who pulled all of this together for us. Without him, we wouldn't be gathered here. And on behalf of Penn New England and of all of us here, I want to offer our profound gratitude, Bill. And so, please, help me welcome Bill Flanagan.
I'm so glad that some of my relatives were here. Hey, Paul Muldoon's creeping up on me. Here's Paul Simon. My moment of glory is over. I know we've had a double album of introductions already, and very, very graciously, but I want you to bear this in mind as the evening progresses. Between these two Pauls, we have a Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, a Kennedy Center Honors, the T.S. Eliot Prize, 442 Grammys, including Lifetime Achievement. Well, that's a slight exaggeration. The Lifetime Achievement, let's just face it, you know, he just wrecked it for everybody else. The presidency of the UK's Poetry Society, very prestigious. The Library of Congress Gershwin Prize for Popular Song. Professorships at Oxford and Princeton. And between them, 2 inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So I'll leave it to you to sort out whose accolades are whose. But, you know. Not since Pierre Salinger dined alone. So I have to, and I apologize because we've been having so much fun that I didn't really organize my questions very well, so we may leap around. But I was just thinking, Paul Simon, that when we were watching that beautiful film of JFK's speech, that the first time that the world heard Bridge Over Troubled Water was over footage of the funeral trains, wasn't it?
Yes, that's so.
Can you explain how that happened for us?
Simon and Garfunkel did a television special in 1969, I think, and we used, it was the first time that Bridge Over Troubled Water was played. It was before the album was released, and the footage was over the trains of, the funeral trains for John and Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And the special was soundly defeated as in the ratings that night by Peggy Fleming.
You got to give the people what they want, man.
And our sponsor that night was Bell Telephone, and they withdrew as sponsor. And they said that they thought that our positions were too political. And we were so naive, Artie and I. We said, what? Like what? They said, well, the footage of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King. And we said, well, what's wrong with that? And he said, well, they're all Democrats. Oh, is that what you think they have in common?
Well, you could have put Lincoln in there, you know, and taken care of the GOP.
Now you tell me.
Paul Muldoon, you grew up, you are just young enough, just old enough to have been influenced, I assume, by Paul Simon and Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen, as well as the poets in the poetry anthologies. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And, you know, when we were hearing earlier on about Bridge Over Troubled Waters being played until the needle wore through and the record, the disc was operating on a memory of itself somehow. That was certainly true for me as a student in Belfast. And that particular disc was one that we played in our student flat apartment round the clock while we were conscious, which was most of the time. But I think the notion of, you know, we've heard this phrase so many times of music having to do with the soundtrack of our lives, and indeed Paul Simon is a great song in which you refer to hearing the Everly Brothers, I think, for the first time. I think I myself, I'm almost 60, belong to that generation where pop music, rock and roll, was truly part of the fabric of our lives. It wasn't even part of the soundtrack. It was just part of our lives. And one took it in one's stride in the way that one took John Donne or Dylan Thomas or Emily Dickinson in one's stride, in one's attempt to make sense of one's life.
Paul being probably the only pop songwriter who ever got Emily Dickinson into a top 20 song. Top 30 song.
I've conveniently forgotten that.
Well,
but you know what? You know, the editing process. You know what is so interesting to me is that you grew up in a world where you had access to poetry and it was part of the culture. It was not a part of our culture, my particular childhood. Although both my parents were college educated and my father was a musician and went on later in life to get his PhD in linguistics and all that. But no, I didn't start reading poetry until I was in college. But it wasn't part of what you hear. That's really important because it's Marianne Moore's line, poetry. I too dislike it. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, my first reaction to poetry was, I don't like this, and nobody explained what a possible avenue would be to access that. You're very fortunate that you had both worlds in your culture, in your life.
Well, again, that was a student culture. I think part of the problem is that, however marvelous Marianne Moore might be, and she's truly marvelous, it's a little difficult to persuade a group of 19 or 20-year-olds, even those who are studying English, to play her round the clock.
Yes.
And it's not. And however wonderful she might be, and she's a terrific reader of her own work, also, it's not, frankly, quite so palatable as to listen to that extraordinary combination of words and music, which gets us in a way that, frankly, even the greatest poetry has difficulty in reaching our cores. So it's partly got to do. Most of us dislike it because we're not used to it. We haven't been exposed to it as much.
At what age? So, at what age were you aware that it was a really important part of your culture?
Well, I think, even as a kid, in the Irish culture, there's a particular relationship between the poem and the song. Yeats, of course, if one looks right through his work, one sees that many of the poems are indeed songs. Right the way through the Irish song tradition, many of the songs are poems and vice versa. There was no distinction between the two. So I think that may have been a component of what was going on. Though I think it would be a mistake, really, for me to suggest that, as opposed to what might be happening in this country, that the Irish are sitting around reading poems and listening, listening to poetry in a way that is very special. I don't think that's quite the case. But there's probably a little bit more of a history of being open to the idea of a poem in its various manifestations, allowing for the notion that the term poem may include a great deal more than what might have found on the page there as a student, having it beaten into one. And I think actually one of the glories of this era is that our sense of what a poem is expanding. It should always have been quite expansive, but I think actually the notion that a poem may occur as a song lyric, for example, as a hip-hop lyric, as a country lyric, as a rock lyric, perhaps not so often, but there's always a chance, and that is actually part of one tradition, is something I think that one might learn from that background that I'm describing. We're trying to do slightly different things, but part of the same tradition.
Yes, I see what you mean. I was thinking, when you said that well, first of all, poetry and Irish poets, that was really the world that you belong to. Your DNA comes from that. My exposure to music, since I had no interest in my father's era of music, what came from the radio. So there was no indigenous Queen's music that I was drawing upon. So I heard, very fortunately, I heard what was in essence world music. Later on they called, Graceland world music. But the music that I heard as a adolescent, pre-adolescent, was really world music. You would hear doo-wop groups. Well, that was true. They literally did sing on the corners. But that music related to gospel quartets, which of course I had no experience, didn't know anything about. And gospel quartets relates to call and response, and so you're heading back to Africa. With that, country music like the Everly Brothers, that's Appalachian, and that goes back to England and to Scotland and to Ireland and to absolutely. And the same is true with let's see, the Louisiana music, which I used to be a big fan of music that came from Louisiana without knowing actually that it came from Louisiana. But really, what I was in love with was the syncopation of that music. That music came from, in the Africa diaspora, up through Brazil and Cuba into Louisiana. And all of this music was played on the radio, the AM radio that I heard, in a way that's very similar to the way our kids listen to an iPod on shuffle. It's so different. It's different. You hear Ray Charles, and then you hear Johnny Cash, and then you hear some group of Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, and then you hear Fats Domino, and then the Everly Brothers, and you're hearing so many different worlds. But of those worlds, it's the sound and the subtext that we understood. We inferred the meaning from that. It wasn't in the lyrics, because the first set of lyrics of early rock and roll were virtually nonsense syllables, woo-bop-a-loo-cha-ba, and bee-bop-a-lula, and womp-bomp-a-looma, womp-bam-boom, or some of it is beautiful. I'm like a one-eyed cat peeping in a seafood store from Shake, Rattle, and Roll. But as listeners, as kids, being exposed to words, what I learned was the meaning is not in the words, the meaning is in the sound. And then we understood that, of course, it was about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's what it was about. But that was unspoken. But we were not exposed to to people who had a great gift of language until we went into a school environment. And to this day, most of us get uncomfortable when September rolls around, thinking that we might have to go back to school.
You know, I think the sex, drugs, and rock and roll component of it was one that even we in Ireland, or particularly we in Ireland, were very conscious of. So there was
sin, death, and damnation, though.
Well,
I believe.
that's the thing. I mean, another component of this was, I mean, apart from my rather poetic description of poetry in the air and all the rest of it, what was in the air was, of course, rock and roll on the various radio stations, including the pirate radio stations.
Yes.
And that is something that I remember vividly as a kid, lying in bed at night under the blankets, listening to the transistor radio with this music that one truly wasn't meant to be listening to. And so there was that component too, which I think that the element of danger about it actually was one of its attractions too. There was a certain amount in the air. But the really interesting stuff was just about band.
John Lennon told me that hearing the pirate radio, I guess it was Radio Caroline.
Yes.
So that was coming from where? In the channel?
A boat anchored out. Well, we were never entirely sure, which is one of the alluring aspects of it too. It could be anywhere, you know, somewhere out beyond the 3-mile limit, and that was part of the mystique and the danger of it.
He remembers that it was so far away that it would sort of come in and out, like this, in a sort of a wave, and he tried to put that sound into the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so Strawberry Fields,
yeah, that's how he heard, he heard this. And I still am trying to, correctly access Bo Diddley and Mystery Train. And it's just those sounds, they become so powerful, the sound. But the poet, of course, skipping subjects a little bit, the poet has to create that same power without the sound, and all with the words. So how do you do that?
Inadequately, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, certainly the saw is, of course, that the poem brings its own music with it and somehow determines how it wants to be performed in the world. Without that other component, and that somehow the song lyric is actually missing something vital that needs to be bodied out, or that's already there in the lyric, as you say, is often just an addendum to it. Though I'm struck actually when you mentioned the Everly Brothers, a lyric like "Wake Up, Little Susie" contains, just a world picture.
Chuck Berry said that was one of his favorite. He thought that was one of the greatest lyrics ever written. "Wake Up, Little Susie," because it was so compactly gave you a scene, a story, the characters, and as they would say in English class, here's the challenge, here's the obstacle,
A dilemma.
a dilemma,
Mm-hmm.
a dilemma. And Chuck ought to know. He was. Paul, do you remember?
He was a poet.
He was a poet.
His imagery is the ease of the language with the melody. It's effortless. He was sort of the first guy that I really studied, but his imagery is incredible. As I was motivating over the hill, I saw a Maybelline and a Coupe de Ville. So clear.
He's motivating over the hill. That's what's fantastic.
Great picture. Great picture.
What's wonderful about that is that one may still hear him. One may still hear a founding father of this particular
he's
genre.
Still here.
As one may the Everlys, as indeed.
That's true.
Although
they don't speak.
Well,
to each other.
That's not the worst thing.
Certainly, although you were writing songs, and in fact had a hit when you were 15 with "Hey Schoolgirl," the moment when we became aware of Simon and Garfunkel, of your writing, with "Sounds of Silence" and I'm a Rock and all that, was a moment when rock began to be conscious of itself as having a poetic mission. I mean, tell me how you came to that, because the sort of writing that you began doing there was vastly different from the Everlys or Bebopalula.
Well, I think what happened is just that we were in 13, 14, 15, and so by the time I was 17 or 18 or 19, I was completely bored with what was going on with pop music and rock and roll. Stopped listening to it. And, you know, I mean, at a certain point, when you realize that it wasn't poetry when they said, I believe for every drop of rain that falls, a flower grows. You know, the first time I heard it, I thought, wow, you know, I believe, yeah, I was very moved by it, you know.
Yeah.
But I was probably 12 or something, you know.
It got you in the door.
Uh-huh.
Got you in the door.
So we just grew up, and the whole generation seemed to grow up. And, I mean, the guy who really led it was Bob Dylan, who started to write about grown-up subject matter, other than let's dance together, or I wish I could marry you someday or something. And he was drawing upon, you know, the left-wing music that came out of the, you know, Union songs and that kind of folk music that the Weavers brought into popularity. And when you found out about the Weavers, then you found out about the Blacklist, and it was the real world, and it was suffering. It was suffering. That's what it was, because America in the 50s was anyway, the world that I was in, which was just a typical middle-class world, was in really a euphoric state. We just won the Second World War, and were the only nation left standing. Yeah. Everybody thought that there was nothing to worry about. There was an enormous amount of optimism, and whatever the repression was for my age, you know, whatever the sexual repression or whatever, as I said, that was the subtext of the music. So we sort of felt that it was not so terribly repressive. And when it got popular enough for corporations to invest in it and to start to build the artists, when there was Fabians and Frankie Lyman's, Frankie Avalon's, and that kind of corporate thing, well, then we stopped listening because it wasn't interesting. Yeah. And it didn't get real again until it was not corporate, with the Beatles, or, well, Dylan, of course, was Columbia Records. But anyway, he wasn't coming from that place. Right. And so at the age of 21 or 20 or something like that, the brightest, or the bright kids, wanted to be that. Yeah. And so they began to listen, and music became eclectic, and particularly out of folk music. When I started to be interested in what was called folk music, I stopped playing electric guitar. I started to play acoustic guitar. I listened to music from other countries, other cultures, and we were off, you know. And when rock and roll acknowledged that and started to incorporate it, when the English rock scene incorporated folk, and when folk rock came from that, well, then the whole genre it started to get closer to people who were trying to say something about their lives, and of course with with a whole bunch of juvenilia to be thrown out. Eventually, some of the songs were quite extraordinary and real, and I think that's how it began. And the description of Dylan as a poet, and the choice of his pseudonym, I think that's what turned people to be serious about how to write songs.
Well, and then, you know, there must have been a moment when you turned around and said, boy, I was Sound of Silence, which had only been out for about 2 years, was on the syllabus of my high school English class. I'm sure it was a way to kind of get the kids with it. You know, we're going to bring them in with Paul Simon, and then we're going to lay the hard stuff on them. But I mean, surely you as a writer began to say, well, okay, if people are paying this much attention to the words, then I'm going to begin to look into it. I mean, at some point you did begin writing, I want to be careful of the word poetic, but very thoughtful and lyrics that weren't really like anything anyone else had done in pop music.
Well, The Sound of Silence is interesting. On this level, I just wrote a foreword to a book by Bernie Williams, the baseball player Bernie Williams. Plays for the Yankees.
I hear it's just for the money, though.
And his book is about the similarities between elite athletes and musicians. He's an excellent musician, Bernie. He's a really good guitarist and studied classical guitar, and that was what he was setting out to be when he started to get scholarships for athletic scholarships. So, because I know him and I like him, I said I would write it, and then I thought, well, the area that's kind of interesting to me about the two fields is this area that, like the zone, what they call the zone, which you hear about athletes are in it, and they hit three-pointer after three-pointer, or the baseball looks as big as a beach ball and they can't miss, or they can't miss a strike zone. And the same is true for musicians who will, hit a period where everything is clear and it seems effortless about how to play. And as a writer, I've experienced that quite a few times, not really a lot, but a few times in my career. And I think that is what happened when I wrote The Sound of Silence when I was 21, although I was completely unaware of it. I just thought, wow, well, that's probably my best song, But for whatever causes that, whatever delicate balance between dopamine and serotonin that,
We don't want to know.
We do want to know. We desperately want to know.
Something that I've heard you talk about, and I want to get Paul Muldoon's take on this too, is that you want to preserve a sense of mystery as you're writing. You know so much after doing it at such a high level for some time that you want to find the place where you don't know what's going to happen. You want to, I don't know if it's a matter of following your instincts or waiting for the muse to tap you on the head, but when you know a lot, when you've taught, is there a tendency to say, how do I turn off that side of my brain and try and get into an area that I haven't uncovered yet? Take it, Muldoon.
For me, absolutely. I mean, when you talk about knowing, for having done it for so long and knowing what one's doing, those are concepts which I'm afraid I barely recognize.
Which concepts?
Sorry?
Mystery? The mystery?
No, the mystery I want to be involved with. But
right.
Absolutely, but my sense is that I know nothing.
Exactly.
Having attempted to do it for so long, I'm perhaps worse off than when I started. I'm certainly no better, and I don't know anything at all. And
well, that's the beginning, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I hope, and I hope that then with that sense of not knowing what one's doing, as if one's starting from scratch or worse, that something interesting will happen. And when I know what I'm doing, it's almost certainly the case that my view is that if I know what I'm doing, you almost certainly know what I'm doing. What's the point? Let's go to a place where none of us ever expected to be. And that at the end of the day, that whatever comes out may be faintly, maybe even more than faintly, recognizable as a poem or a song. But when one embarked on it, the hope was that it would be something the likes of which no one has ever seen, you know. So in that sense, the zone is about ignorance, and for me anyway.
Well, if you think that the mystery is ignorance, but I don't think of it as that. I think of it as a real essential thing, and I don't want to know. It's like arrogant to say I don't want to know, because you can't know. It's a mystery.
Yeah.
That's what's so great about it. So you pursue it because it's so enticing. It's like bliss. Well, you can't access bliss. Somehow, if you're lucky in your life, you find yourself in that state. If you try to possess it or hold on to it, of course it goes away by definition because it's a peak experience. But what I was going to ask you is, what about... Well, let me ask you this question first. At what point in your life did you think you were an artist?
You know, I don't mean to be, what would one say, seem falsely humble, but it seems like a huge term to lay on oneself.
Right.
You know, honestly.
I know. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I honestly...
You could be a bad
I
artist.
go in fear of people who present themselves as artists. I really do. I am a person who tries to write poems. And, you know, maybe on a good day, if one's extremely lucky, one might manage it every so often. But that's all I would say, honestly.
That's an artist.
There you go.
Yes. Well,
see, what Bill said I think is exactly so. I had a lot of difficulty with that term and never wanted it applied to me. As I say, I didn't come from a background where anybody ever talked about art or being an artist. And it wasn't until I was in my 40s that I said, I am an artist. It doesn't mean I'm a good artist.
Right.
It's a kind of a personality type. I like to make up things. They seem to come to me, and I get all excited when it happens, and then I try to do that, and that's the way I like to spend my time, and that's an artist. And the culture produces a certain amount of people who do that, and their work in general nourishes the need for art. And for those who do that and their work isn't embraced in their lifetime or ever, well, it doesn't really matter because somebody else's work is being embraced and the culture is being fed, and this group of people, their jobs are, you know, to do that. And why, we really don't know, but the mystery is a thing that's... It's sort of why you do it,
right?
Because it's so enjoyable to sense that there's a big mystery, and that you got a glimpse of it, and now you're following it. Well, you never find it, but sometimes if you create something and it comes close to, well, maybe some really great artists say, "I found it," you know, Michelangelo or I don't know.
They'd probably be
Joyce
finished then. You know, that would be the beginning of the downward slope, wouldn't it? They'd say, well, you know, boy, I'll tell you, that Burt Reynolds was really good until he did Deliverance, and then it was all downhill. You know, one thing that is in both your work is that sense of exploration, the sense of one of your poems or one of your songs may start out in, you know, as part of this club. And as it goes along, it keeps taking left turn after left turn. And, you know, sometimes you wonder how he's going to get back to where he started. Sometimes you do a triple somersault and you get back. And sometimes you just stay out there. And to put you on the spot, Paul, and I should say this because you guys haven't had a chance to hear it yet. Paul Simon has a new album, which is, I think, one of the best things he's ever done, and boy, is that saying something. And everyone I know, and I'm embarrassing you, Elvis Costello said, this is the best album anyone's made in 15 years, and I mean anyone. I played a song from it on Lou Reed's radio show on Christmas. I played Getting Ready for Christmas Day, and Lou stopped and said, put that on again. We're going to play that song twice. You know, to continue the parade of embarrassing name dropping, you know, I saw Bono the other day, and he said, well, yeah, he did. He said, you know, that's what I'm listening to, that new Paul Simon, and it isn't out yet. So to illustrate these left turns, and to share what everybody's so excited about, could I ask you to step over to the sixth string and give us maybe Love and Hard Times? There's no getting out of it after that build-out. And I hope it's not presumptuous to say that if John F. Kennedy were alive, this would be his favorite record.
But before I begin, since you said you didn't want to sound like name-dropping, I'm going to tell you the best name drop I ever heard.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's not, I don't know how I'm going to do this because my strap is broken here.
Do you want the stool?
I think I'll have to do that. Anyway, this is the best name drop, and it doesn't have anything to do with the song at all. Is this mic on?
Yeah.
Show business joke. Is this mic on? Okay, so it starts off, the name drop is not the way I'm going to start off. I was having a conversation with the Dalai Lama. That's not the name drop. And the Dalai Lama said to me, in the middle of this conversation, he said, I remember once Mao Zedong said to me, I said, that is the best name drop I have ever heard.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. Let's see, I guess this guitar is maybe is not on.
Can you hear the guitar? They said they can.
You can? I think you're hearing it off.
Beautiful
of this.
acoustics.
Well, I'll have to do it with a mic. It's the way we used to do it. God and His only Son paid a courtesy call on earth one Sunday morning. Orange blossoms opened their fragrant lips. Songbirds sang from the tips of cottonwoods. Old folks wept for His love in these hard times. Well, we gotta get going, said the restless Lord to the sun. There are galaxies yet to be born. Creation is never done. Anyway, these people are slobs here. If we stay, it's bound to be a mob scene, but disappear. And it's love in hard times. I loved her the first time I saw her. I know that's an old songwriting cliche. Loved you the first time I saw you. Can't describe it any other way. Any other way. The light of her beauty was warm as a summer day. Clouds of antelope rolled by. No hint of rain to come in the prairie sky. just love, 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 love. When the rains came, the tears burned, windows rattled, locks turned. It's easy to be generous when you're on a roll. It's hard to be grateful when you're out of control. And love is gone. The light at the edge of the curtain is the quiet dawn. The bedroom breathes in clicks and clacks. Uneasy heartbeat can't relax. But then your hand takes mine. Thank God I found you in time. Thank God I found you. Thank God I found you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Kind of makes me feel stupid to just talk after that. You know, just to continue on what I was saying, what's extraordinary about that song is that it begins with God and His only Son coming to earth, coming into a garden. It sets you up for one thing, and then you say, well, these people are slobs here, which immediately it surprises us and turns us around. And then God kind of leaves the picture, and until the very end of the song, when the man says to his wife, "Thank God I found you in time." You know, you get that. It does make its way back, but by a route that no one else would have taken, I think. Paul, you have not heard that song before.
I've heard it before.
Oh, you have heard it before.
I've actually had the opportunity to hear this CD and love it. Yeah, so I have heard it.
You do. You both do something that's interesting, which is that you will throw the slob into the mix right when we're in the garden. You both would, you know, Paul, you famously put the word Gatorade in a song because you said, you know, it was a word that didn't sing. But just as you might put in a discordant note, you put in a discordant word. And, you know, Paul Muldoon, I mean, you know, this is a man who wrote a poem about a testicular cancer examination. I mean, you have really, you've...
Is that what you think that poem's about?
Well, I'm referring to the charge of the Light Brigade, of course. You know, there've been some images, you know, as your new book, Maggot, would represent. There are some discordant images that pop up, and I wonder if that's, you know, do you say it's time for an elbow in here, time for a boomerang, or just everything's available?
I think everything is available, and I think that's one of the glories of this age. I mean, and most other ages, everything was available to the poets of the Hebrew Bible. Everything was available to William Shakespeare, to Chaucer, in terms of I mean, we've become accustomed to the notion that it's only in recent times that so-called high and low might be combined in art with the capital A. Not at all. I mean, I have no idea what high and low might be. I have no idea. Gatorade is part of one's life.
And a very delicious part.
And a very delicious part too. And you know, and as if writing songs and writing poems is about making sense of things, and I think one of the great things that we might deduce from that last song that Paul Simon sang is that, you know, here's a song that there's nothing wrong with the song that's about, let's go on our first date. Now that's an ongoing and wonderful element in the rock and in the pop, whatever we call it, pop music, rock and roll, I don't know what we call it, canon. And let's go for our first date in our Prius. I don't know, maybe that. Anyway,
well, that would be a social conscience song.
Absolutely. Whatever it might be, that's still going. But the song that addresses the predicaments, the dilemmas, to use that word, the circumstances of the adult lives of those same people who across the ocean were lying in bed at night listening to pirate radio, or who in this country were, trying to figure out what was happening at Woodstock, or what was happening with this extraordinary coincidence of social upheaval and popular culture.
Yeah.
Those people, the people are in this room. We all still need to hear the songs and the poems that make even more sense to us in our present predicament, where the image of the light coming under the blind there, or the curtain, was it? The drape?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where?
And do you know where he came from?
No.
Philip Larkin.
Does it? That's so interesting.
Yeah. It's from Obad.
Obad, of course. Yeah. Well, I think.
Well, Philip Larkin took a lot from Chuck Berry, so it all comes around.
Yeah, some things that we can't even discuss probably on the internet. In terms of some of his famous lines. But I think that is an important thing to realize, that there is that two-way street. Poets, in the conventional sense, I think, learn a huge amount from songwriters in the conventional sense, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the wonderful things that's happened in this era. So Larkin, now when would you have started to read Larkin, for example?
20 years ago, 25 years ago. He's one of my favorite poets in the second half of the 20th century, but I really read him in very small doses because I believe everything he says, and it's so depressing.
It can be somewhat depressing.
Oh yeah, and also he stopped writing, and at least anyway, this is what I always thought was the case. He stopped writing, and when he was asked why, he said the muse deserted him. And that thought really frightened me and stayed with me for a long time. And I thought every time I had finished an album and couldn't think of anything else, people would say, well, when are you going to do another album? I'd say, I don't know if I will. And they say, oh, you will. You always say that. And but Larkin didn't, and so I thought it wasn't possible. Or as Steve Martin said to me, people always say to me, oh yeah, it's going to be funny, you'll see. And he says, why, because you go like that?
Yeah, well, what I would say on that topic is that if one believes in some notion of the muse, there is some chance that she might believe in you. If you don't believe in it, there's maybe no chance.
Yes,
so it's risky.
Yeah.
It's risky. It's scary, and you think, will it ever happen again? This particular, this particular high, and I think when you talk about the dopamine, and that's a major component of it, and that, in fact, is the area that we do want to see a little. Both of us want to see more study in that particular area.
I'm worried that if we find the dopamine formula, that just nobody's going to be dentists or driving buses.
But you know what?
Of course they will. There'll be incredible bus drivers.
And we'll have
all
bumps full
want
of
to ride.
of
We'll all want
flaming
to ride
teeth.
the bus.
And the thing, but at that stage, people like myself who have shied away from it will come out
From
and say,
dentistry.
No, from artistry. Will come, will come out and say, yeah, I'm an artist. I filled a couple of cavities last week. But anyway.
Well, all right, now, Paul Muldoon, it's
Yes.
time for you to step up.
Oh, really?
Would you read The Loaf for us, and then I'll tell you why?
Okay. Yes. Certainly. This is a poem that is... I will step up, actually, if I may. This is a poem that is, I suppose, on the cusp that I was describing earlier on between poem and song. It has a little...
That's why I asked.
It is a little refrain, which, while it's not quite in the category of a boo-wop, whatever it is, a boo... Yeah, I knew it was something like that. It's going in that direction. So anyway, it's I won't say much about it, just to say that it's having to do with a series of sensations through a hole in a wall. The loaf. When I put my finger to the hole, they've cut for a dimmer switch. In a wall of plaster, stiffened with horsehair, it seems I've scratched a 200-year-old itch with a pink and a pink and a pinky pick. When I put my ear to the hole, I'm suddenly aware of spades and shovels turning up the Gain, all the way from Raritan to the Delaware, with a clink and a clink and a clinky click. When I put my nose to the hole, I smell the floodplain off the canal after a hurricane, and the spots of green grass where thousands of Irish have lain, with a stink and a stink and a stinky stick. One wants to join in. I feel... When I put my eye to the hole, I see one holding horse dung to the rain, in the hope, indeed, of washing out a few whole ears of grain, with a wink and a wink, winky. And when I do at last succeed in putting my mouth to the horsehair fringed niche, I can taste the small loaf of bread he baked from that whole seed, with a link and a link and a linky lick. Thank you. Thank you.
You know, if they sing along the first time they hear it, it's a hit. I wanted to get that not only because it did illustrate what we were talking about before, but also because of the joy in language. And that's something that you both have too. For the profound things you say and for the beautiful things you say, there's also, I thought it was interesting, Paul Muldoon, that you picked Paul Simon's 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover as a lyric in the little booklet that they handed out as a lyric you admire.
Well, there are many, and I'm not just saying that because we happen to be sitting here. There are many, but yeah, I love that one.
And that is a celebration of rhyme. Yeah? That's where it started?
Yes, I was teaching my son, who was 4 or 5 at the time, about rhymes. That's why I made that. That's why I made it. Yeah,
and
you know, simple rhymes.
It's in Think Too Much where you rhyme Los Angeles and unscramble us.
Yes.
You know, I mean, and those are just things that even and that's a fairly serious song, but that's just a great moment. That's a moment that shows, Jack Nicholson said once, every great actor, even if he's playing King Lear, has to somehow convey his love of acting. And I think what both of you do is, you convey your love of language within these songs and within these games you play. I have to embarrass Paul Muldoon for a minute because, and I won't embarrass my daughter who speaks French who's sitting here by trying to read the Baudelaire, but in Baudelaire's The Albatross, which you did a translation of, there's a line that talks about the sailors pulling the albatross onto the boat and torturing this noble bird by humiliating it. And I want to read you 3 other translations, just one line. William Agler said, the line was, pathetically let their great white wings drag beside them like oars. And when it was translated by Roy Campbell, he rendered it as, they piteously droop their huge white wings and trail them at their sides like drifting oars. And when it was translated by George Dillon, he said, goes hobbling pitiably across the planks and lets his great wings hang like heavy useless oars at his side. Now, Paul Muldoon's translation was, a pitiable pair of paddles. Now that's just having fun with Baudelaire.
Yeah, I'm not sure how Baudelaire's estate will feel about that, but I'm not too worried, perhaps.
It's public domain at this point. One thing that you both do is that in your songs, in your poems, you locate yourselves within the tradition. Many the poet shows up in your poetry. There's as many as there are farm animals. There are romantic poets and contemporary poets traipsing through your verse. And Paul, again, you have a new song where a man comes face to face with God, and all he can think of to say is "Bebop-a-lula." And again in your songs, in the late great Johnny Ace, and in Renee and Georgette Magritte, where it's the moon glows and the 5 satins, that first music that you loved sort of comes back, and you take your place in that collection. Is that a matter of, first of all, are you both conscious that you do that, and what do you think it means? Who wants to go first?
Well, I just enjoy inserting all of these little doo-wop references into my songs. For the most part, they're just little jokes, and they don't mean anything. But in the case of the Magritte song, I was using the names of the groups, the Penguins, the Moonglows, the Orioles, the 5 Satins, because it sounded so beautiful, their names. And to put Magritte in there was to already begin a surreal composition, which is what he was. Yeah. Which is what he was doing. That's what Magritte was.
The juxtaposition. Yeah.
So I was writing a song, and as I wrote it, I thought, well, talk about writing for a narrow audience. I'm writing probably here for Ahmet Erdogan, somebody who knows who they are and has a couple of Magrittes on his wall. Otherwise, they don't know what I'm talking about. But that's all it was the surreal, putting that content into a surreal form, because the sound of the words made you feel that there was something mysterious about it.
How do you find that tension? I mean, isn't it more interesting for you to just go to Magritte and allow people to come to the song and to an idea of Magritte, rather than perhaps being overly concerned about whether or not they are going to get it?
I lied about that.
You lied about what?
I wasn't overly concerned.
No, and I don't think you should be. I think you're right, because one of the great things is that we hear that song and some of us have some vague idea about, some less vague than others, idea about Magritte. But actually for some people, one of the great things they might say is, there's a Paul Simon song about René Magritte and his wife, And it actually got me interested in René Magritte. And I think that's something that we tend to forget. We're so concerned nowadays about what people understand in an era when, frankly, people, please forgive me, from what I can see, understand less and less. I mean, I was in a school somewhere the other day, I was sent a bill, I think, earlier on, where they clearly had never heard of James Fenimore Cooper. And one might say, well, that's okay, he's a dead white male and he couldn't write for nuts anyway. However, there's something faintly troubling about that when we listen to JFK talking about a nation and what its writers might mean.
Well, let me jump in there and ask something that, Paul, you said in the fall when I saw you. You said making this album, you were asking yourself, is the form that I work in still relevant? And I think if that's true of the rock LP, it has to be something that someone setting out in a life of poetry has to ask himself. Is the form that I work in still relevant?
That may be why I've never admitted to have set out on a life of poetry.
Ah, that's it.
Now, you know, of course it's still relevant. Of course it's still relevant.
That's the answer that we know. You know is coming when you ask the question.
Yeah,
You just have to periodically ask the question so that you can say to yourself again, well, of course, it's what I do, and if I have any doubts about it, I'll try and make it so obviously relevant by being good that will be the answer to the question. Now, maybe I'll succeed or maybe I'll fail at that, but I do think that when something is clearly powerful in whatever way, the reason I'm hesitating here is I'm thinking, well, actually, the art that I like is all art about beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I'm writing, I look for beauty, and then I feel, that's good. But of course, there's a lot of art that isn't about beauty at all. It's still art. So in a certain sense, really, it's like, what kind of art are you involved in that evokes that question? You know, is it relevant? I don't know, but I don't think that Tarantino thinks, am I relevant?
Right.
He's obviously relevant because people respond to that sense of violence and storytelling that jumps around, and that's another form of art. But if you're Matisse and you paint that way, you're not going to be Picasso and paint
Guernica.
Yeah. So really, I mean, it gets back to a certain question about art again, which is, what is it that you aspire to when you're making something, and what is it that you want to connect yourself to, and have others connect to through you. In my case, I think of it as, I like art that's beautiful as opposed to art that's upsetting or art that's nihilistic, but you need all of it to express how we all feel.
But you know what is interesting is, another thing that both of you do is that you will have a disruptive image, and I'm not just talking about a word like Gatorade, but the bomb in the baby carriage was wired to the radio. There's a bombing that takes place when you don't expect it on the new album. You've got the vest of dynamite, strapped to the suicide bomber in I think one of the poems in the new book. There is that sense, and I think it's very resonant to people living in the world now, that the violence of the world can intrude. It can even intrude in the middle of this verse.
Well, yes, but look, I mean, movies are filled with violence portrayed as beauty.
Right.
Explosions, they'll show you 4 or 5 different shots of the same explosion. And what is it? It's some beautiful color filling the screen. But if you happen to actually be near an explosion where someone was incinerated, or any of those elements, well, you can see what happens to, to a whole generation of soldiers. They come back with a very high percentage of post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. Violence is not beautiful. Whether it's art, well, I guess it is. I don't know. I can't remember who said. He was roundly criticized for it. It was one of the Italian film directors who said that that 9/11 was a moment of a great art. That the buildings falling was great art. Well,
that wasn't Bill Maher, was it?
No, it wasn't Bill Maher.
Okay.
It was one of the film directors. It might have been.
Probably just as well not to say, because we'll just, he won't be able to go through the
Anyway, of course he had to retract that, but that was what he felt. He looked at it and saw it as some astounding image, and thought of it as art. Most of us think of it as, horror and fear and.
Yeah. But it's true that almost everyone who saw it, his first reaction was, it's like they thought they were watching a disaster movie, because we hadn't seen that in life. We'd only seen it in the movies. Another line of yours that I love, and I'm going to try and entice you back, because I know that our time is running short, is "A pilgrim on a pilgrimage walked across the Brooklyn Bridge." That's a line that just immediately, that song could have gone anywhere, and I would have gone with it. Questions for the Angels. Would you favor us?
I'll try. I'm not good at this one. Wasn't too good at the last one either, as a matter of fact.
Sounded good.
Thanks for the One of the things that I think of as I'm writing is that the first line, I envision the first line having this shape, meaning it could go anywhere, as opposed to here, where in a verse or two I'm going to be finished, and so I don't want that. So a pilgrim on a pilgrimage walked across the Brooklyn Bridge was fun. It was a little bit funny, and it was also a road song.
It's a road song.
So let's see how I'm going to do this. Oh yeah, this guitar. Pilgrim on a pilgrimage walked across the Brooklyn Bridge. His sneakers torn in the hour when the homeless moved their cardboard blankets and the new day is born. Folded in his backpack pocket, the questions that he'd copied from his heart. Who am I in this lonely world, and where will I make my bed tonight? Twilight turns to dark. Questions for the angels. Who believes in angels? Fools do. Fools and pilgrims all over the world. If you shop for love in a bargain store and you don't get what you bargained for, can you get your money back? If an empty train and railroad station calls you to its destination, can you choose another track? Will I wake up from these violent dreams with my hair as white as the morning? Questions for the angels. Who believes in angels? I do. Fools and pilgrims all over the world. Downtown Brooklyn, The pilgrim is passing a billboard that catches his eye. It's Jay-Z. He's got a kid on each knee. He's wearing clothes that he wants us to try. If every human on the planet and all the buildings on it should disappear, would a zebra grazing in the African savannah care enough to shed one zebra tear? Questions for the angels.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love it.
Thank you. Thank you.
You don't hear Jay-Z in that many mentioned in other. I guess actually you do hear Jay-Z mentioned in other people's songs. Has Jay-Z heard the song? It's a shout out.
No, I don't think so. It hasn't come out yet.
Well, he may sample it, you know. Paul Muldoon.
It's just sort of what you were talking about before about everything being in there. As the song is sort of dreamy with words that you don't really think of. A pilgrim. I mean, how many pilgrims do we know in our life? And the Brooklyn Bridge and the questions that he starts to ask, they're sort of the typical questions. Who am I? And where will I sleep? And what about love and all of this? And those become sort of the first questions for the angels. And then when he crosses the Brooklyn Bridge and he sees the billboard of Jay-Z, which actually was a billboard that I saw, I think it changes the perspective of the song, and you're not just in some dream landscape. And then comes the real question of the song, which is if there were no human beings, the whole species were gone, would the rest of the living creatures on the planet really, would a zebra shed a tear? No, I mean, it's a terrible species. If I weren't in it, I would definitely be opposed to it.
I'm going to have a T-shirt made. If I weren't in it, I would definitely be opposed to it. That's pretty much my attitude toward most things. Paul Muldoon, I have to really put you in a terrible spot here, because I was thinking about the two of you in relation to each other. The other day, I read with new eyes the poem Ontario from Meeting the British, 1987, which opens with my Uncle Pat's face falling in slow-mo and the constellations of the Northern Hemisphere. I thought, you must have been listening to Graceland when you were writing that poem. Constellations, hemisphere, and slow-mo all in the same place.
It's conceivable now. I can't remember what that. What do we say? That would have come out in. It's quite. Certainly, I was listening to Graceland also in endless cycle. Though I don't think we were using the term.
That's 87.
Is that
right on the money?
Yeah, I think that'll be right. Yeah, I'm sure, absolutely. And if I wasn't listening,
now you got the Baudelaires and the Simons.
Sure, nothing to do with Grace.
Yes. Well, I do. I think a lot of the time, of course, one's not necessarily conscious, and one of the things that one's trying to do is to the extent that one might allow for, say, in that song you've just sung, the connections between that song and is it America? We've all gone to the one about the New Jersey Turnpike?
Yes.
I mean, that's a song that's in dialogue, I think, with that song, isn't it? Yeah. And I think there may even there's a rhyme in there which goes back to the era of Bridge Over Troubled Water. There's another rhyme. Sorry? Homeward Bound. Yeah, Homeward Bound. Railway station? Yeah, thank you. So,
Man, that Penn group is one smart bunch of kibitzers.
These are readers. These guys have heard of Cooper, I'm pretty sure.
He created MASH.
But what's interesting about that, it's a take on the fact that it's in conversation with your earlier wonderful song is, I think, gives it even more depth.
I think we're all allowed to take. I think it's the common pool should be enlarged.
Yes.
And people should feel free to go and. No, I don't feel any particular ownership about this. I didn't make up anything.
Well, I think that's critical to the notion of the muse. If you believe in the muse, you're simply a vehicle for the muse. You're really just standing in there and doing one's little part, I believe, and allowing art to come through.
Well, one of Keith Richards' great excuses for staying up for a week at a time was that if he went to sleep, the songs would go to someone else. So that's pretty good. We're way past our time, and I do want to read a couple of questions from the audience. But before I do, I want to say that one of my favorite songs is a song by Warren Zevon called "My Ride's Here." Springsteen did a version of it that I had on repeat in my car till my children wanted to jump out of the car. And I only found out about 6 months ago that my friend Paul Muldoon co-wrote that lyric, which maybe explains why it's so good. And to totally blur the line we've been blurring for the last hour between lyrics and poetry, and to make the case that the song lyric is a fourth room of literature that deserves its own, its own entry. Would you? Yeah, let's hear it from. Nobody's going to argue with that now. Paul, could I ask you to read "My Ride's Here"?
Certainly. Now, this was co-written with Warren Zevon. Warren, of course, who, among many distinctions, was the musical director, I suppose, for the Everly Brothers.
That's right.
In one manifestation.
It all comes back to the Everlys, doesn't it?
It all comes back to the Everlys. Well, a lot of it does. My Ride's Here. Let me see. Yes. I was staying at the Marriott with Jesus and John Wayne. I was waiting for a chariot. They were waiting for a train. The sky was full of carrion. I'll take the Mazuma, said Jesus to Marion. That's the 310 to Yuma. My ride's here. This was way before the recent remake, by the way. The Houston sky was changeless. We galloped through blue bonnets. I was wrestling with an angel. You were working on a sonnet. You said, I believe the seraphim will gather up my pinto and carry us away, Jim, across the San Jacinto. My ride's here. Shelley and Keats were out on the street, and even Lord Byron was leaving for Greece, while back at the Hilton, last but not least, Milton was holding his signs, saying, you bravos had better be ready to fight, or we'll never get out of East Texas tonight, for the trail is long, and the river is wide, and my ride's here. I was staying at the Westin, I was playing to a draw, when in walked Charlton Heston with the tablets of the law. He said, it's still the greatest story. I said, man, I'd like to stay, but I'm bound for glory. I'm on my way. My ride's here.
Now
thank you very much.
Of the many beautiful things in that song, I think my favorite is rhyming carrion with Marion, John Wayne's real name.
That's right.
When I heard that, I said, oh, we're reminding people John Wayne was Irish. And he was a Morrison. Just take credit for it, Paul. All right. We'll take a couple of questions from this very patient audience. Either of you can grab this. Can you speak to any moments in your writing process when you knew you had knocked it out of the park, a line that seemed to fall from God, and in turn, any lines you wish you could take back?
You want me? Sure. Let's see, lines I wish I could take back. Well, of course I prefer not to tell you. There are some. Most of the time I feel anybody can be bad. So, why should I be overly ashamed of stuff, So I was pretentious when I was young. Well, you're supposed to be. Anyway, it's my excuses. Myself, lines that I thought that really surprised me and stopped me. The moment that I sang, like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down with that melody, I was very surprised. And I thought, where did that come from? That's much better than I usually write. But that's sort of going back to the zone. When you really don't, I was just really too young to know that sometimes you're in some place and it happens, and you're the conduit, and when it happened to me later in life, I was very grateful when it happened, and I loved the mystery of it. Another time that I can remember it happening was in Graceland, when I wrote "Losing Love is like a window in your heart," and I had to sit down. I was whatever it was really telling the truth about something in me. Same was true for when I thought up Still Crazy after all these years, which I was thinking me. I wasn't making up a song. I was disappointed at what was going on, but then I thought, boy, that's the songwriter, that's the poet, that's the artist. I bet I can use that. As you start to recognize it. Oh, there are other times too. There's a song of mine called "Darling Lorraine."
Yes, I love that song.
Oh, thank you.
That's a great song.
It's filled with moments where something happens and you realize, and I'll tell you like what happened. The song starts. And I start these songs, with some line that's going to allow me to go to the next song. I have no idea what the subject matter is when I begin a song, because the music is usually written, and I'm trying to find words that have the sound of the melody. Like if it was a very high note, I wouldn't try and say, well, that's great for me. You don't want to be up there on an E sound, you want to be up there on a wah sound. So I begin, the first time I saw her, I couldn't be sure. But the sin of impatience, which was a line I had written in a book, in my little notebook, and probably had for a few months, said, she's just what you're looking for. So I walk right up to her. Meanwhile, I'm still all in songwriting cliche. I walk right up to her, and with the part of me that talks, okay, that's nice. It's not a cliche. I introduce myself as Frank from New York, New York, which I think is funny whenever they say New York, New York. I think it was like New York. Well, once when I was playing in England, they introduced me and they said, "And now from New York State," which was better than another introduction I had in England, which was when I played in a working man's club in Manchester, I think, and the guy said, Shut up, shut up, you've had your fun. Shut up now and give artists a go.
That's why I don't describe myself as an artist.
Exactly. Well, I didn't think of myself as then either. But anyway, so Darling Lorraine. The first time I saw her, I couldn't be sure. Impatient, said, just what you're looking for. So I walked right up to her, said, the part of me that talks. I introduced myself as Frank from New York, New York. She's so hot, she's so cool. I'm not. I'm just a fool in love with Darling Lorraine. This is all cliches. I'm just a fool in love, you know. And then I begin the next verse with, all my life I've been a wanderer. Another line that I have absolutely no interest in. If anybody had that in a conversation and began it at a party and said that to me, I would be thinking, how can I escape? All my life. Really, tell me about it. So I knew that as I wrote it, and I said, all my life I've been a wanderer. Not really. I mostly live near my parents' home. Anyway, Lorraine and I got married. You know, I love the way the guy he's so self-involved. He just switches course, and I really made a note of that. That, you know, if you get trapped in a song, you don't have to stay there. You could turn around and say. Psh. Anyway, Lorraine and I got married, and the usual marriage stuff, which I thought, Lorraine and I got married. Now, what am I going to have to do? Explain things now? I mean, sort of. And the usual marriage stuff. That's not important. And then one day she says to me from out of the blue, Frank, I've had enough. Romance is a heartbreaker, and I'm not meant to be a homemaker, and I'm tired of being Darling Lorraine. And then the guy says, what? You don't love me anymore? What? You're walking out the door? Again, you know, kind of typical songwriter stuff. What? You don't like the way I chew? You know, to which my wife said, you can't say that in the song. Everyone will know that it's about us. I said, no. Nobody will know. And anyway, it's probably been said in other times and places. You don't like the way I chew? Hey, let me tell you, you know, this guy. You're not the woman that I wed. You say you're depressed, but you're not. You just like to stay in bed. You know, totally unaware, you know. I don't need you, Darling Lorraine. And then Lorraine, he says, Lorraine, I long for your love. So this opening up of the heart, you know, and I think, good, I'm on a story. The guy is he's so self-involved and cliche-ridden, but he opens up his heart. But then he immediately closes, because the next line he says, financially speaking, I guess I'm a washout. I mean, everything is buy and sell and buy, and that's what the whole thing's all about. And if it had not been for Lorraine, I'd have left here long ago. I should have been a musician. I love the piano, which makes me laugh, you know. But anyway, she's so she's so free. Mm-hmm. She's so light, she's so free. I'm tight. Well, that's me. But I feel so good with Darling Lorraine. And then it went to, on Christmas morning, I think I'll remember. On Christmas morning, Frank awakes to find Lorraine has made a stack of pancakes. They watch the television, husband and wife, all afternoon. It's a Wonderful Life, which seemed like a good Christmas line, you know. What? But then they're back in, what? You don't love me anymore? What? You're walking out the door? What? You don't like the way I chew? Hey, let me tell you, you're not the woman that I wed. Give me my robe. I'm going back to bed. I'm sick to death of you, Lorraine. And as soon as I wrote that, I said, oh my God, she's going to die. And the whole song changed. You know? And then Lorraine, her hands like wood. The doctor was smiling, but the news wasn't good. Darling Lorraine, please don't leave me yet. I know you're in pain. Pain you can't forget. Your breathing is like an echo of our love. Maybe I'll go down to the corner store and buy us something sweet. Here's an extra blanket, honey, to wrap around your feet. All the leaves were washed with April rain, and the moon in the meadow took Darling Lorraine. But that that moment of, I'm sick to death of you, Lorraine. You know,
Well, you know, I would have no hesitation in saying that that's as good as anything Philip Larkin ever wrote. Really, and I think Philip Larkin would say that too.
Let's have a vote.
Seriously. No, seriously. Absolutely. It's a brilliant song.
My hero.
It's a brilliant song. It's the better example than I pulled out of, as I said, the songs that keep unfolding. And you feel, and again, both of you do this in your work, you have that, the reader, the listener, can share that sense of exploration, that you don't know what door is going to open next. So we don't know what door is going to open next. And Darling Lorraine, you know, is a fantastic song.
And by the way, it was a doo-wop song, Darling Lorraine.
Well,
another, and I say I keep putting it in. There was a doo-wop song called Darling Lorraine, and I just said, yeah, that's a great title.
And this kind of shows us, all right, 50 years later, where's that couple from the doo-wop song? And the other thing is that the last line, when she dies, and suddenly, you know, it's Annabelle Lee. I mean, suddenly we're out of the realm of doo-wop, we're out of our time, we're in classic verse, classic poetry, because that's what this schmo, you know, in the song has suddenly become, because we all do. Eventually, everyone's life is a tragedy. I know. Forgive me, because we're going way over time. I haven't asked the questions I should have asked, but I think we'd all agree that if we have 5 minutes left, could we impress Paul Simon to sing us one more song on the way out? And you know, your call, Paul.
Once I said to an audience, thank you for your tepid response.
Thank you for what?
The top of my heart.
Why would they tell me that I was hardwired when I'm not? This is an old song, early 70s. Seems to have a little kind of resonance now with what's going on in Egypt. Starry-eyed. Oh, we were satisfied. Oh, and I remember misinformation followed us like a plague. Nobody knew from time to time if the plans were changed. Oh, if the plans were changed. You can beat us with wires. You can beat us with chains. You can run out your rules, but you know you can't outrun the history train. I've seen a glorious day. Nowhere to go but back to sleep, but I'm reconciled. Whoa, gonna be up for a while. Whoa, I'm gonna be up for a while. Whoa.
Thank you, everybody. I want to thank Paul Simon.
Such a pleasure to be with you.
I think
Bill,
that
thank you so much.
Richard Hoffman is going to come up and say something. I want to thank Karen Wolf and everybody from Penn for inviting us up here. I want to thank you folks for hanging in. Paul Muldoon and Paul Simon. Richard Hoffman, ladies and gentlemen.
Wow. Well, first of all, I just want to let everybody know to please keep your seats till our guests have left the stage, and that the JFK Library Bookstore has copies of Paul Muldoon's and Bill Flanagan's books, and Paul and Bill will be happy to sign them for you in the back of the auditorium. And now I have an announcement. I've been waiting all night to make this announcement. As many of you know, Penn New England offers literary awards for poetry, fiction, nonfiction, children's books, and nature writing. Tonight, we're pleased to announce the establishment of the Penn New England Award for Song Lyrics of Literary Excellence. We're also proud and immensely grateful that Bill Flanagan has agreed to chair the award committee. No, Stalin used to do this too. So you'll all be hearing more about this new award during the next year, so stay tuned. Actually, that's always good advice, as I'm sure our panelists would agree. So thank you all for coming. Have a good night and stay tuned.